Jake never expected that a simple act of mowing a strip of grass would turn into a full-blown neighborhood showdown. Dale, the self-appointed HOA security chief, exploded in anger and pulled a gun on Jake right in the middle of a sunny suburban afternoon. Within minutes, the quiet street transformed into a SWAT operation, complete with armored trucks and shouting officers. Dale was tackled, disarmed, and humiliated while the neighbors watched from their porches in disbelief. That afternoon marked the beginning of the end for a corrupt HOA leadership that had ruled the community through fear and petty rules. Let me take you back to that wild day when a little grass and a lot of pride turned an ordinary neighborhood into ground zero for the most ridiculous standoff you could imagine. Jake was just finishing mowing his lawn, music blasting in his ears, when he decided to make a few extra passes over the communal grass strip by the sidewalk. He figured it was no big deal, better neat than messy, and certainly not worth causing a fuss. As he wheeled his mower back into the garage, a figure stormed across the street like an angry toddler denied his favorite toy. It was Dale, wearing cargo shorts, a too-small tactical vest, and a security baseball cap, carrying a clipboard like he was about to conduct a police raid. Jake pulled out his earbuds just in time to hear Dale screaming about unauthorized property alterations and accusing Jake of vandalizing HOA land. At first, Jake thought it had to be a joke. He tried to explain calmly, telling Dale it was just a neighborly gesture to keep things clean, but Dale's face was already beet red with fury. Before Jake could even process it, Dale unclipped a holster from his belt and pulled a handgun, leveling it right at Jake's chest like he was starring in some discount action movie. For a moment, everything froze. Jake's instincts screamed at him to move, but instead, he raised his hands, staying calm even as his heart pounded. Across the street, Jake's wife had already hustled their kids indoors, and his brother-in-law, Kyle, sitting under a tree 2 houses down, dropped his lemonade and pulled out his phone. Kyle, the SWAT commander for their county, was already moving before Dale could even finish shouting his half-baked threats. Dale, oblivious to the world closing in around him, continued shouting ridiculous phrases like "you have the right to remain silent" and "you are under citizen's arrest for destruction of property." Jake, never one to pass up a chance for sarcasm, muttered "oh no, not the sacred grass," making Dale even more furious. Then the neighborhood erupted. 2 black SWAT trucks skidded onto the street, their tires screaming against the asphalt. Officers in full-body armor poured out, moving with brutal efficiency, weapons drawn but measured, lights flashing off the pastel-colored houses like a surreal dream. Kyle's voice thundered from a loudspeaker, giving Dale one warning to drop the weapon. Dale, now realizing he was hopelessly outmatched, looked like a fish gasping on dry land. He dropped the gun as if it burned him, raising his hands with a pathetic whimper. In less than 30 seconds, Dale was face down on the pavement, zip-tied and sobbing about how he was just protecting the neighborhood. Neighbors who had been peeking from behind curtains now spilled onto their lawns, phones out, recording every second. Some clapped, some laughed. One old man even started a slow clap that rippled down the street. Jake, standing there stunned, caught Kyle's eye and gave a sheepish thumbs up. Kyle just shook his head in half amusement, half disbelief. Jake knew deep down that this was only the beginning. Dale's crazy outburst was just the first crack in the dam. Something rotten had been festering under the surface for far too long, and judging by the way Kyle was barking orders and leading his team toward the so-called HOA headquarters, things were about to get a whole lot crazier. Jake looked around at the stunned faces of his neighbors and then down at the tiny strip of grass that had somehow sparked an all-out suburban war. He let out a disbelieving laugh, the sound growing louder until he was throwing his head back in full-on hysterics. Only here, he thought, could mowing the lawn nearly get you shot and still not be the craziest part of the day. The so-called HOA headquarters at the end of the cul-de-sac looked harmless enough from the outside, just another model home left over from when the neighborhood was first built. Fresh beige paint, bushes trimmed neatly into spheres, a bright blue front door that seemed to smile at you, inviting you in. But behind that cheerful facade was something far more bizarre brewing. A twisted parody of law and order that had been festering for months without anyone realizing the full extent of it. Jake stood a few paces back with a growing crowd of neighbors, the scene unfolding before them like a slow-motion train wreck they could not look away from. SWAT officers moved with sharp, precise steps, their body armor and tactical gear making them look like soldiers stepping onto a battlefield rather than a suburban front lawn. Kyle led them forward, barking clipped orders into his radio, his face set in a tight, grim line. Jake could hardly believe what he was seeing. Who in their right mind needed a headquarters, a literal operational base, just to hand out pool passes and enforce lawn care rules? But after watching Dale pull a gun over a patch of grass, Jake figured normal logic did not apply here anymore. Inside, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, paced furiously in front of a giant whiteboard covered in wild scrawls and arrows. A crude hand-drawn map of the neighborhood showed each house labeled with petty offenses like grass too tall, wrong shade of shutters, suspected bad influence. She wore a ridiculous navy blue jacket 3 sizes too big, a crooked gold star pinned to the front, and aviator sunglasses pushed up on her forehead, like she was about to give a press briefing from a war zone. Around her sat the rest of her inner circle, for other HOA board members hunched in cheap folding chairs, looking like the saddest excuse for a command center anyone had ever seen. The long plastic table before them was littered with walkie-talkies, outdated police manuals, half-empty coffee cups, tasers of questionable origin, and a stack of HOA violation notices printed on blinding neon pink paper. Above it all, a giant laminated poster screamed Operation Neighborhood Domination in bold black letters. Karen barked out orders like she was leading a military coup instead of managing a suburban housing development. She declared the neighborhood officially on red alert and ordered everyone to barricade the windows with filing cabinets and prepare for a siege. She waved around a ridiculous homemade battle plan showing flanking maneuvers and fallback positions, even though half the board members probably could not tell their left from their right under pressure. They armed themselves with non-lethal deterrents from their so-called arsenal, which included modified leaf blowers rigged to spray vinegar, frozen paintballs loaded into old paintball guns, and a sad collection of garden tools taped together like medieval weapons. It would have been hilarious if it were not so dangerously stupid. Across the street, Kyle observed through binoculars, muttering to his second-in-command Ramirez that he had seen less insane setups in cartel compounds. Informants, mostly terrified teenagers forced into Karen's junior security team, had confirmed that the HOA had been stockpiling this junk for months, using HOA funds to buy gear, some of it homemade, some of it suspiciously real, like tactical batons and stolen body armor. Jake tried not to laugh as he stood nearby, watching Kyle work through strategies for the breach. Kyle knew people like Karen rarely thought rationally when cornered, and the last thing he wanted was someone doing something truly stupid with one of those stolen tasers. Karen, meanwhile, was deep into full delusion. She ordered shifts at the single working radio, convinced that enemy forces, meaning actual law enforcement, would try to jam their communications first. She declared they would claim asylum under sovereign HOA bylaws if captured, ignoring the fact that HOA bylaws had absolutely no authority against federal law. Her followers, either too scared or too deep into the madness, nodded along like disciples in a cult. At one point, one timid board member raised his hand and asked what they would do if the police showed up with real firepower. Karen, not missing a beat, announced that they would defend the headquarters to the last man or woman, using their garden tools and homemade pepper spray as necessary. The absurdity was breathtaking. Outside, Kyle finalized the breach plan. No lethal force unless absolutely necessary. Use multiple flashbangs to disorient. Enter from 3 sides at once. Overwhelm quickly and safely. Neutralize without injury if possible. It sounded clinical and professional, but Jake could see the tightness around Kyle's mouth. This wasn't just about clearing out some delusional homeowners anymore. It was about preventing real harm, because the longer Karen stayed in control, the greater the chance someone would end up seriously hurt. Back inside, the HOA defenders braced themselves. Karen strapped on an oversized military backpack stuffed with who knows what and donned knee pads she had picked up from a clearance bin at a local hardware store. She looked like a child playing soldier, but her face was deadly serious. She barked final orders, declared herself the last line of defense, and told her crew to prepare to resist the coming assault at all costs. Jake felt the air shift, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Kyle gave a nod, and everything exploded into action. The SWAT team hit the front door with a battering ram just as multiple flashbangs went off inside, bathing the house in blinding light and deafening noise. Chaos erupted. Board members screamed and dove for cover, one falling over a folding chair in a tangled heap. Karen shrieked commands that no one followed, trying to rally her collapsing army from behind the long table before two officers yanked her out like a misbehaving child at a school play. Neighbors gasped and cheered as the entire sad militia was led out in handcuffs, blinking and coughing from the flashbangs, their homemade weapons abandoned on the floor like forgotten toys. Karen was still clinging desperately to her clipboard as if it could shield her from reality. Dale, red-faced and zip-tied once again after mouthing off to an officer, stumbled down the front steps, looking utterly defeated. Someone in the crowd started chanting "HOA, and laughter rippled across the street. Jake just shook his head in amazement, whispering under his breath, "Welcome to the end of your reign, Karen." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting everything in a golden glow, the SWAT trucks rumbled back to life and prepared for the next phase. Jake stood silently among his neighbors, feeling the kind of cathartic relief that only comes when a long nightmare is finally over. But deep down, he knew this was just the first battle won. There was still a whole rotten empire to clean up, and Jake, armed now with a lawnmower, a sense of humor, and a whole community at his back, was ready for whatever came next. The moment Karen and her cronies were hauled away, the real work began. Kyle and his team wasted no time securing the so-called headquarters, methodically moving room to room, documenting every bizarre, unsettling thing they found. What had started as a ridiculous suburban standoff was rapidly transforming into a full-blown criminal investigation that would ripple far beyond the neatly trimmed lawns and pastel houses of Freedom Lane. The garage had been converted into what Karen proudly labeled the Strategic Resource Center, but looked more like a hoarder's garage sale of stolen goods and absurd makeshift weapons. Boxes labeled security equipment overflowed, with everything from tasers of questionable origin to two-way radios, many still bearing city property tags that suggested a serious theft operation. There were camping supplies purchased with HOA funds, crates of pepper spray canisters clearly stolen from law enforcement stockpiles, and zip ties by the hundreds, stacked like they were preparing for a mass kidnapping event. Moving deeper into the house, Kyle's team discovered an even more alarming room labeled Operations Command in shaky block letters duct-taped to a door. Inside, the walls were plastered with crude maps of the neighborhood, each house marked with ominous red XS and labels like suspected traitor, grass violation repeat offender, and unauthorized Christmas lights. The degree of surveillance and petty monitoring was chilling. There were binders filled with printed screenshots of residents' social media pages, logs of who parked where and when, and detailed notes about everything from garbage bin placement to dog barking complaints. Some of the notes were handwritten in a scrawl that grew increasingly unstable as the pages went on, descending into outright rants about maintaining community purity and rooting out insurgent elements. But that was only the beginning. In a back closet, officers found a stash of fake IDs and laminated badges declaring Karen and her board members as special officers of community enforcement. The photos were laughably bad, most of them badly photoshopped onto official-looking backgrounds, but the implication was deadly serious. These were not just props for a Halloween party. They had been used to intimidate, harass, and extort money from homeowners who dared to cross the HOA's invisible, ever-changing rules. Ramirez pulled out drawers stuffed with fake violation notices, many demanding fines upwards of $500 for absurd charges like insufficiently festive holiday displays or hosting unauthorized social gatherings. Every fine came with an implied threat of further action, and many residents had paid out of fear, not knowing they were being scammed by their own supposed protectors. In the kitchen pantry, Kyle found yet another twisted surprise. Color-coded files organized residents into categories based on perceived loyalty to Karen's regime. Green for loyalists, yellow for potential risks, and red for hostile elements. Every minor infraction, every hint of rebellion, was cataloged with a disturbing thoroughness. It was surveillance on a scale no one could have imagined happening in a suburban neighborhood. Worse yet, tucked in among the household supplies, they found receipts and paperwork that painted an even uglier picture. Karen had been funneling HOA dues into fake shell companies she controlled, with names like Neighborhood Safety Consultants and Suburban Defense Supplies, billing the HOA for fictional services like tactical training sessions, security audits, and emergency preparedness drills. The money funded personal vacations, spa retreats, high-end electronics, even a custom-built bunker kit that, judging by the receipts, was probably hidden somewhere nearby. Kyle's jaw tightened as he surveyed the mountain of evidence piling up. This was no longer about a rogue HOA with delusions of grandeur. This was organized criminal behavior wrapped in a picket fence fantasy. Charges were going to pile up faster than the officers could count. Embezzlement, wire fraud, theft of government property, impersonating law enforcement, unlawful imprisonment attempts, conspiracy to commit fraud, and misuse of HOA funds were just the beginning. Federal prosecutors were going to have a field day with this mess. Jake watched from behind the police perimeter, arms crossed, a feeling of deep, satisfying vindication settling in his chest. For years, he and his neighbors had felt something was wrong, but had no way to prove it. Now it was all laid bare in broad daylight for everyone to see. The street outside the headquarters transformed into a chaotic media circus within an hour. News vans swarmed in, reporters jostling for position, breathlessly describing the scene with words like suburban terror cell and militarized HOA uprising. Jake found himself accidentally stepping into frame more than once, answering the same questions over and over, always with the same dry response. "All I did was mow the lawn." That simple line quickly became a rallying cry for the neighborhood, printed on hastily made t-shirts and signs that residents proudly displayed on their porches. Kids rode by on bikes chanting it. Someone even painted it on the sidewalk in front of the old HOA headquarters in big, bold letters. Meanwhile, Karen, now locked in the back of a patrol SUV, was not taking her downfall quietly. She screamed about constitutional rights, sovereign citizen status, and community self-determination, demanding to be released immediately and threatening to take her case all the way to the Supreme Court or at least Judge Judy. No one took her seriously anymore, not even her former inner circle, most of whom sat silently in other patrol cars, their faces slack with defeat and embarrassment. Dale was still trying to spin the narrative, insisting to anyone who would listen that he had been conducting counter-terror operations on behalf of national security. Not even the most gullible reporter was buying it. Inside the wrecked headquarters, Kyle's team cataloged more horrors. Hidden under a false floor in one of the bedrooms, they found a stash of real police tactical gear, including riot shields, tear gas canisters, and ballistic vests, all stolen. Evidence suggested Karen had inside help from a corrupt supplier or even someone within local law enforcement, a discovery that promised to widen the investigation far beyond their quiet little neighborhood. Every piece of evidence made the charges against Karen and her board stack higher, and it was clear by sunset that this was going to be a historic takedown. Jake stood by with a small group of neighbors, watching as evidence after evidence was carried out of the house. The same people who had lived in fear for so long now laughed openly, cheering each time another ridiculous piece of the fake empire was dragged into the open. There was a tangible feeling of release, a community exhaling after years of tension and silent resentment. For the first time in what felt like forever, Freedom Lane felt like a real community again. The tyrants were falling, not with a bang, but with the slow, humiliating whimper of petty bullies being dragged into the light. And Jake, who had never asked for any of this, who had only ever wanted to mow his lawn in peace, stood at the center of it all, a quiet hero in a story no one could have made up if they tried. As the dust from the raid settled and the last of the fake HOA officers were driven away, the neighborhood found itself standing at an unexpected crossroads. The old regime was gone, stripped of its clipboards, bogus fines, and intimidation tactics, but the scars it had left behind were deep and raw. People had spent years looking over their shoulders, second-guessing every decision about their lawns, their decorations, even their conversations. It would take time to heal, but for the first time in a long time, there was genuine hope hanging in the air. Jake stood on his porch with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, watching as clusters of neighbors who once barely made eye contact now gathered openly, laughing, talking, comparing stories. It was like the fog had lifted and the neighborhood was waking up to itself again. That evening, without any formal plan or announcement, people started pulling out folding chairs and gathering on Jake's front lawn. It started with just a few families, but word spread fast, and within an hour it seemed like half the neighborhood was there. Someone brought a portable speaker and played soft music. Others brought trays of cookies, pitchers of lemonade, and coolers packed with soda and water. It felt less like a meeting and more like an unplanned family reunion, the kind that happens when everyone has survived something big and needs to be together just to make sense of it. Jake tried to melt into the background, but it quickly became clear the neighborhood had other ideas. Mr. Hardrove, the oldest resident on the block and someone who had seen the neighborhood grow from its first street to what it had become, stood up slowly. His voice cracked slightly as he thanked Jake for doing what no one else had dared. He spoke about how Freedom Lane, back before the HOA madness, had been a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where a barbecue or a block party was just part of life, not something you needed a permit for. His words triggered a floodgate. One by one, others stood and shared their own experiences, their own frustrations, their own quiet fears. They spoke about fines for non-existent violations, for being late a day on trash bins, for having a garden gnome considered inappropriate by Karen's secret standards. They talked about feeling trapped in their own homes, afraid of drawing attention for even the most harmless actions. Hearing it all laid bare like that, with no shame, no judgment, only understanding, was powerful in a way Jake had not expected. Jake realized then that this gathering was not just about gratitude or catharsis. It was about reclaiming something deeper, something that had been quietly stolen from them all while they were too busy or too intimidated to notice. A community spirit, its soul, had been hijacked by fear, and now they were taking it back. As more stories poured out, someone suggested they needed to set up a new HOA, but one that would actually serve the people rather than rule them. A wave of agreement passed through the crowd, a ripple of determination. It was not just about removing the tyrants. It was about making sure no one ever had that kind of unchecked power again. Someone proposed a vote, and almost instantly, names were shouted out. People volunteered to be part of a new interim board, neighbors who had lived there for years, who had helped shovel snow for each other, lent ladders, watched each other's pets. Jake tried to back away, hands raised in protest, but the laughter that greeted him was warm and insistent. Kyle clapped him on the back, grinning like a proud older brother, and someone shouted, "Too bad you broke it, you bought it." And just like that, with a show of hands and more than a few jokes, Jake found himself elected as the new HOA president. He tried to argue that he had no experience running anything more complicated than a backyard barbecue, but no one cared. They did not want a politician or a manager. They wanted someone who had proven, without even trying, that he understood what community really meant. Jake's first act as unofficial president was to insist that all future HOA meetings would involve barbecue, lemonade, and absolutely no fines without a unanimous community vote. The cheer that went up from the crowd nearly shook the block. As the impromptu meeting wound down, people lingered, unwilling to break the spell of belonging that had settled over them. Children played freely, darting between adults, their laughter unburdened and pure. Neighbors exchanged phone numbers, real ones this time, not for complaints but for cookouts and coffee mornings. Plans were made for block parties, for streetwide yard sales, for holiday decorating contests judged by the kids, not by a power-hungry clipboard tyrant. It was more than rebuilding. It was reimagining what living together was supposed to look like. Jake stood back, watching it all, a strange mixture of pride and disbelief filling his chest. He had never set out to be a leader, never wanted to be the center of anything. He just wanted to mow his lawn and maybe be left alone. But sometimes life drags you into battles you did not ask for because staying silent would have meant letting the wrong people win. And when you find yourself there, knee-deep in chaos, with nothing but your principles and a rusty old lawnmower, you stand up anyway, because someone has to. As twilight deepened into a soft, velvety night and porch lights flickered on one by one like distant stars, Jake lifted his cup of coffee in a quiet toast to the absurd, beautiful, unpredictable journey that had brought them all here. The past was a mess, but the future stretched ahead wide open, full of laughter, second chances, and the simple, radical idea that maybe, just maybe, good neighbors could save the world, or at least their little piece of it. Morning broke over Freedom Lane with a kind of soft brilliance that seemed almost too perfect, as if the street itself were breathing a sigh of relief after surviving a long, absurd nightmare. The golden sunlight bathed the sidewalks and freshly mowed lawns in a warm glow, and the air was filled with the easy laughter of kids racing their bikes down the pavement without a care. Jake stood in his driveway, a cup of coffee in hand, feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction settle into his bones. For the first time in what felt like forever, there were no clipboard-wielding tyrants lurking behind hedges, no passive-aggressive violation notes tucked into mailboxes, no sense of being watched for some imagined infraction. The neighborhood felt alive again, free in a way that it had not been since long before Karen and her fake army took over. But the story was not quite finished. Not yet. Today was the day the final piece of the old regime would be torn down and sold off, one humiliating artifact at a time. It was auction day, and the entire neighborhood was ready to celebrate the symbolic dismantling of everything Karen had built. Government trucks rumbled into the cul-de-sac just after sunrise, carrying agents and officials who had been sifting through the wreckage of the HOA headquarters for weeks. They were there to oversee the auction of all seized property, and by mid-morning, Freedom Lane had transformed into something halfway between a county fair and a full-blown block party. Residents set up folding chairs along the sidewalks, unpacking coolers filled with sodas, lemonade, and enough snacks to feed an army. Someone inflated a massive bounce house at the end of the street, and a few families even brought grills, sizzling hot dogs and burgers, filling the air with mouth-watering scents. Kids ran wild, chalking the sidewalks with colorful drawings and slogans like "Long Live Freedom" and "Lawn Care for Liberty." Jake wandered through it all, greeting neighbors, laughing easily in a way he had not allowed himself to for a long time. There was a bounce in everyone's step, a sense of victory that went deeper than just the fall of a petty dictator. They had taken back their home, and today they were making sure everyone knew it. The auctioneer, a stout man in a cowboy hat and mirrored sunglasses, climbed up onto an old picnic table turned stage and called the crowd to order with the booming energy of a man who was absolutely in his element. He announced that all proceeds from the auction would go toward repairing the neighborhood's community center and funding new projects proposed by the residents themselves. The cheers that followed shook the trees. It was a new beginning, one they had all earned the hard way. One by one, the items went up for bid. Modified leaf blowers labeled chemical deterrence systems. Homemade medieval-looking weapons fashioned from duct tape and garden tools. Stacks of neon pink violation notices with Karen's signature scrawled at the bottom. Each item drew laughter, jokes, and fierce-fitting wars driven more by humor than practicality. A teenager won a rusted taser for $5 and promised to mount it in his bedroom as a trophy. A group of stay-at-home moms pooled money to buy the entire box of fake police badges just so they could burn them in a backyard bonfire later that night. Jake waited patiently for the main event. When the auctioneer announced the sale of the old HOA headquarters itself, starting the bid at $1, the crowd fell silent. Jake raised his hand immediately. No one else moved. There was an unspoken understanding in the air. Jake deserved this win. He had earned it more than anyone. The auctioneer slammed the gavel down with a flourish, and just like that, Jake became the proud new owner of what had once been the seat of suburban tyranny. By mid-afternoon, a small army of neighbors had gathered to help Jake gut the building. Out went the whiteboards filled with paranoid maps. Out went the stacks of ridiculous bylaws. Out went every shred of Karen's delusions of grandeur. Walls were scrubbed clean, rooms repainted in cheerful, bright colors, and windows thrown open wide to let the sunlight pour in. By sunset, the house was unrecognizable, transformed into something full of life and joy rather than fear and pettiness. A fresh, hand-painted sign hung proudly above the front door, reading Freedom Park Community Dog Haven, and underneath it, in smaller letters, a plaque that simply said, "In loving memory of petty tyrants everywhere." Families flocked to the new dog park with their pets, lawn chairs popping up across the grass like wildflowers. Someone set up a small stage where a local band played upbeat tunes as kids and dogs raced across the lawn. Grills fired up again, and the scent of barbecue hung thick and welcoming in the evening air. The atmosphere was pure magic, the kind of community spirit that could not be manufactured or forced. It had to be earned, and they had earned it. Every laugh, every song, every cheerful bark. Jake sat on the porch steps with a cold drink in hand, watching it all unfold with a deep, satisfying sense of peace. Kyle dropped down beside him, handing over a fresh soda and clinking the cans together in a silent, shared toast. They said little because they did not need to. Everything important was right there in front of them, alive and loud and real. Just when Jake thought the day could not get any better, a man in a crisp polo shirt and khakis approached, carrying a tablet under his arm. He introduced himself as a reporter from a major news outlet, there to cover what was now being called the Great HOA Rebellion. Jake laughed and agreed to an interview, never expecting that within days, his face would be plastered across TV screens, news websites, and social media feeds across the country. Memes exploded across the internet. One showed Jake heroically mowing his lawn under the bold caption, "The first shot of freedom." Another depicted Karen, mid-meltdown, captioned, "When your HOA dreams die hard." Celebrities tweeted about it. Comedians roasted it in late-night monologues. Politicians used it as a rallying cry for grassroots activism. Jake, who had only ever wanted to quietly maintain his lawn and be left alone, became an accidental folk hero for standing up when it mattered most. When the hidden recordings Karen had made of her own meetings surfaced, filled with threats, conspiracy theories, and naked extortion, it sealed her fate in spectacular fashion. The charges stacked against her were staggering, guaranteeing that she would spend decades learning about community service the hard way. On the day Karen was officially sentenced, the neighborhood threw the biggest celebration yet. There were fireworks, a dunk tank with a cardboard cutout of Karen, and a commemorative plaque unveiled at Freedom Park that read, "Freedom isn't free. Sometimes it costs a lawnmower, a SWAT raid, and a lot of stubborn neighbors who refuse to back down." Jake stood quietly at the edge of the celebration, smiling to himself, heart full in a way he had not felt in years. As the stars came out and the music played on, Jake looked around at his neighbors dancing, laughing, and living without fear, and he realized something simple and powerful. Heroes are not always the loudest or the bravest, or the ones looking for a fight. Sometimes a hero is just a guy who refuses to let bullies win, who stands up when it would be easier to sit down, who mows a little strip of grass and ends up mowing down a whole rotten system. And standing there on Freedom Lane, watching his community come alive again, Jake knew one thing for certain. Some battles, no matter how ridiculous they seem, are absolutely worth fighting. Because sometimes, in the end, the smallest stand makes the biggest difference of all.